Welcome to this lesson, a course overview of CIS-119, Introduction to Programming using Visual Basic. Here are our objectives for this lesson. After viewing this video, you will have a general understanding of what the Visual Basic programming language is, what the Visual Studio Integrated Development Environment is and how it relates to VB, why and how we will use the Flowgorithm learning tool, and what CloudTime is, and how you may use it to access a free virtual computer in the cloud already configured with the software you need this term. In the segments that follow, we will explore what is Visual Basic, grammar, logic, the Graphical User Interface. We will also explore what is Visual Studio, what is the Flowgorithm tool. We will explore using Flowgorithm to help learn VB, and we'll answer the question, what is CloudTime? In this course, we'll be programming in Visual Basic. Visual Basic, like all computer programming languages, has a regular syntax and a grammar. And unlike human language, written or spoken language, a computer language has to be very concise and unambiguous. There can't be any ambiguity allowed. And so the grammar and the syntax and the use of keywords is much more stringent than what we would permit in communicating with a human being who might be able to intuitively understand what we intend to convey with our speech or with our written word. Okay, so let's have an example of what syntax is. So here we have a module open in the Visual Basic language, and we're going to create a main subroutine. And in here, we're going to give a couple simple commands and create a Hello World program. Hello World is kind of a traditional program that does the simplest thing that a computer program can do, which is just to output a line to whatever its display method is. Print it on a printer, or put it on a video screen, or send it to a file. Okay, so we're going to do a little Hello World, and the syntax here has a regular structure of an object and a method, and then the string value, the text value that we want to display. Okay, so to our console object, we're using the WriteLine method, and that's the way that Visual Basic syntax is structured. Okay, so syntax is just regular grammar. One of the things that the integrated development environment, the programmer's editor, in this case Visual Studio, can do for us is if we make a mistake in our syntax, that can often be detected. So let's say I misspell line. When I do that, notice that the IntelliSense system gives me a red squiggly line that says, I don't know what you're trying to convey here, but that isn't a recognized existing object or keyword, and so that syntax is not correct. So syntax errors are pretty easy to detect. They're often detected for you automatically and at the design time when we are writing the code. Okay. So we have to adhere to proper grammar rules, and the IntelliSense system will help us to do that. The other aspect of a computer language that we will encounter is our logic. And unfortunately, the logic can't be tested or detected automatically for us by the editor to tell us if we're telling the computer to do something silly. So as long as we use proper syntax, our logic can, of course, be flawed. Okay, so let's take a look at the results of a very simple program. And so our main subroutine, which is going to be invoked when we execute the program, is going to the console object, invoke the WriteLine method, and output hello world. And then to keep the window from closing on us, we're going to open a console window here. We're going to have a little read key. So it's going to wait until I hit a key to finish the run. So let's go ahead and run that. And here we have hello world in the output, and it's waiting patiently for me to hit a key, which I'll do now, and the program ends. In our last video segment, we went a little old school and programmed a text-only, a console-based program using our Visual Basic. Visual Basic also allows us to program for the Windows Graphical User Interface environment, and everything in the graphical world is an object, and objects have methods and properties. So let's recreate the equivalent of that first code in a graphical format. So here I have a Windows form to which I've added a button and a text box. And if I double click on the button, I can add code to this object. So this is the code for the button object, and this code is an event handler that handles when the button is clicked. So when this button is clicked, what do we want it to do? We want to make a change in another object, the text box object, and we're going to change the text property, which currently has nothing in it, and we're going to change it to hello world. So that's the equivalent of our console write line in the text-based world in our graphical world. So we're going to output the same message, hello world. Essentially, the program does the same thing, but in a more elegant graphical method. So let's go ahead and run that and see how that runs. So here's my Windows form, here's my empty text box, and here's my button. And there's lots of different events that are happening as I move my mouse around. You see the button respond to one of when the mouse goes over it. So the mouse going over or entering the button, those are events. The event we programmed here is when the button is clicked. So let's go ahead and do that now. The button is clicked, the code is executed, which changed the text property of the text box 1 control and displayed our message, hello world. And then to end the program, we click on close. So far, we've discussed briefly what the Visual Basic programming language is. But what is this Visual Studio thing, and how does that relate to our work this term? So Visual Studio is a programmer's workbench. And a programmer's workbench, almost like a workshop, has many, many different tools in it, all laid out, as it were, metaphorically on a craftsman's workbench, where the craftsperson would have all their tools right at hand to do any of the work that they need in building a project. And moreover, a project could be many different types. So if you're working out in your garage workshop, you might be doing an electrical project, or you might be doing a plumbing project, or a craft or a woodworking project. So a workshop or a project workbench allows you to do many different kinds of projects, and that's true in Visual Studio as well. So let's take a look at that. If I say File and I tell it to open a new and choose Project, there are many, many different projects, and these will change depending on how your Visual Studio is configured. For example, I could work on projects using the Visual C++ language, and in that language there are many different types of projects that I could work on. Visual C Sharp is another one, and again, many, many, many different types of projects that I might work on, and so on. So here we're going to be working this term exclusively in the Visual Basic language. So one of the things you want to check when you get started and are creating a new project, make sure that you select Visual Basic as the project you're going to work on. And then within Visual Basic, there are several different types of templates for different projects we might get working on. And that's a lot like working on in your garage on, did you want to work on an electrical project today, or a plumbing project today, or a craft project, or woodworking, what have you. Okay, so we're going to be working exclusively in our exercises and our assignments this term in what is known as a Windows Form project. So it's going to have the GUI, the Graphical User Interface, GUI, GUI. However, for some of our learning and exploration that we use our Flowgorithm tool for, we may also work in the console app, the .NET Framework console app. And the console app is like the old style computing before there were GUIs and Windows and nice, Mac Snow Leopard interfaces and those kind of things, all just plain Jane text in the console app. So the reason I mention that is that when you layer in the complexity on someone learning about programming structure and programming languages, and you add all these graphical objects and object-oriented paradigm programming and other things, it tends to be a lot at once. So we can use the Flowgorithm project and some plain Jane, more straightforward code to learn using our console app um, motif rather than doing everything solely in the Windows framework. But we're going to use the Windows Form app and the GUI for all the work we turn in for credit. So the console app is going to be strictly used as a learning tool to kind of unwind some of the graphical complexity. Okay. So once we have projects that we have created out there, we can also use this file open, and we can come to an existing project or solution and reopen projects we've worked on recently. So for instance, in the last example, I think Windows App 2 was our little Hello World version. We can open that back up and open the solution file. And we're back to where that was, and we can run it again. So other parts of the Visual Studio that we're going to learn and explore, we've already started learning about the program editor. And as we saw, the program editor is intelligent. So if we make a syntax error or a spelling error in a known reserved word or keyword or any variable that we've declared that is suddenly not recognized, if I say text, we get the IntelliSense, and it will help to show us what we've done wrong. The other thing that's really handy here is as we start to type, IntelliSense will give us a list of objects that resemble what we're typing. And so rather than having to type the entire keyword, we can select it. And then if we're talking about properties or methods, we can get code snippets and further assistance. So text box 1 is an object. What are the kinds of things that we can do with it? Well, we changed the text of it, but we could also change the size or the layout, the alignment, the length of the text, where the top corner lives, the location, the width of it, all kinds of things. So IntelliSense helps us to know all of those keywords. As we're learning as programmers, we may not know all of the properties and methods of an object or all of the keywords, and it can help us to more quickly find the keyword that we're looking for and to learn new keywords about how an object can be changed in terms of its properties or the things that it can do using its methods. Okay. Let's take a look at another thing we can do, and you don't have to remember all this right now. We're trying to get just an overview. So there is also something called a debugger. And the debugger is sort of like a medical x-ray machine for our code. It allows us to look within the body of the code while the code is running. So I just came over here and clicked in the gray margin to the left of this command that is going to change the text of the text box. And what I've done is set a breakpoint. So if I run this in debug mode and start it running, what will happen, oh, I have a build error. Oh, remember I changed the spelling? It's telling me there's a syntax error there. There we go. Let's build it again. All right, so now when that click event happens, the debugger is going to run the code down to this breakpoint, and it will stop immediately before this command executes. Bam. And so it stopped in real time, and this is where we are in the code. And in the debugger, I can then look at the call stack, and I can look at the value of different variables and different events that are going on, and I could add to the watch list. So if I want to look at what is the current value of textbox1.text, it will tell me there's nothing in there. It's empty quotes, so it's empty. And now we can step through this a line at a time. So we can sort of freeze time and run through our code very slowly. And I can do that by stepping to the next. So if we look at debug, if I want to step over a uh, a piece of code, we can continue, that will continue running after the break. But if I want to run one step at a time, I can step over this line to the next line of code. So if I hit F10, or if I click here, that will do it. And notice that when I stepped over that, the code executed, and the watch window is telling me that the contents of the text box 1 text value changed to hello world exclamation mark. So very, very useful. And then we can continue the run by pressing F5. And now we have our window back, and you can see what the results of that execution were. So don't worry too much about the details of the debugger right now. The point is that our Visual Studio is a programmer's workbench. It allows development in a number of different programming languages, and it brings all together tools such as the code editor, an intelligent programs editor, a debugger. The other thing that it's doing for us, that when I press start, it's doing a build, and so it's compiling and linking the code. And so compiling is the task of taking all this human readable code, source code we call it, and it is converting it, because we said this is unambiguously equivalent or can be translated unambiguously to specific computer binary instructions for the CPU and the operating system that we're using. And so that's what the compiler does. It converts this to the equivalent machine language codes, the binary codes that tell our processor exactly what to do. And that's done for us in the compile step. And then the link step, as you might imagine, this is a very short program, like 3 lines, really all the work's being done by one line. But in order to make a window and make it appear and give it all the Windows controls, there's actually a lot of additional code that we didn't write that we're kind of inheriting, that creamy, golden, delicious goodness. Those are coming from the .NET Framework library. And so the compiler compiles the code we wrote, and then it hands things off to something called the linker. And we told this project that it was going to be a Windows form project. And so that template knows that there are Windows components that need to be joined in, code that's already been pre-written for us by the good folks at Microsoft or elsewhere. And or we can even write our own libraries in the future when we become really proficient programmers and link our own tools in. But nonetheless, it joins that up. The linker combines our code and adds in those missing pieces that support it, and we end up with a running Windows application, and voila, our Windows form application appears, our controls are rendered, the code executes as it should, and we also get these nice controls for minimizing, resizing, or closing the window, all for free as part of what the linker has done, bringing those pieces in for us. So that, in short, is our Visual Studio. And so again, we've so far talked about what is the programming language we're going to work with, which is Visual Basic. And a language has syntax and grammar and logic. And we've talked about the tool that we use to develop and program our Visual Basic in, and that is Visual Studio. Visual Studio is our programmer's workbench, and it provides the intelligent program editor and the debugger and the linker and the compiler, and actually several other things that we'll touch on as we go forward. The next question we need to address is, what is this Flowgorithm thing? And Flowgorithm is a learning tool that allows you to make working programs of a very simple sort using the visual symbols from a flowchart diagram. And in the early days of computing, flowcharts were used extensively to help design, engineer, and diagram the design of a computer program and to illustrate your logic. And it's very useful because seeing things visually is the way a lot of people work best. Not everyone is a visual learner, but a lot of people like to express things visually, spatially. It makes it quick to, at a glance, understand what's going on with something. Now, some shops still do quite a bit of flow charting. Others have gone to other methodologies for documenting or creating their program designs. But we're going to learn the art of flow charting. It's particularly useful as we train our brains to do something that's a little unnatural for human beings. Since we're intuitive creatures, we tend to go from one thing to the conclusion of that thing without having to consciously step by step, all of the individual pieces that were required to get to the conclusion. Computers can't work that way. They have to work procedurally, step by step, item by item, with nothing omitted, and everything has to be precise and correct. We, however, can train our brains. That's the most plastic and elastic computer we have, and the one we're used to programming first. We can train our brains to do things in a highly detailed order. It just takes practice, but it doesn't come naturally. And so I think that this Flowgorithm tool is really helpful in building the logic and helping us to see what we need to do step by step. And what I really like about it, as opposed to just giving you a drafting template of Flowgorithm or flowchart symbols and having you draw them, is that when you draw the logic that you intend and it is correct, it will run correctly. You can actually run this as a program. And so let's see how that works. So you can test things even if you're working in the middle of the week or 2 in the morning. You can test your ideas out to see if your basic program logic is correct. And you'll recall from our discussion of Visual Basic that and in Visual Studio that the programmer's editor can use IntelliSense to tell us if our syntax is wrong. If we spelled something wrong, it can be very helpful. But it can't detect if our logic is unsound, if we're thinking something that's foolish or untrue. Okay, so let's see how this works. I have the basic Flowgorithm template open. This is what you get when you open a brand new Flowgorithm project. And if you right click on the flow line, you will find that there are different programming symbols, flowcharting symbols. And here we're going to replicate our hello world. So I put an output there. And now to program that symbol, if I left click on it twice, it says enter an expression below. Okay, so I want to enter a string literal or text literal, and that's in quotes. I would like it to say capital H, E, L, L, O, comma, capital W, O, R, L, D, exclamation, and then I need to end that with a quotation mark to tell it that this is a literal text value. It's not a variable I'm referencing. That's part of our syntax convention. That's part of what the Visual Basic grammar requires. And I'll say OK. And that is a complete program. Let's test it and see if it works as intended. So I tell it run. And lo and behold, here is our console output in Flowgorithm, and it output the message hello world, which is indeed all that we asked the program to do. So that appears to be working correctly. So that's what the Flowgorithm tool is. It has tools and symbols that allow us to build the more complex logic structures, so it has flow of control, so we can look at things like input, output. We can declare variables, assign them, put in decision control, call subroutines, and then we can also, let's move this over a little bit, and now you can see it. We can also put in iteration and looping and our decision structures. So decision structures like if, our looping structures like while a condition is true for some specified number of uh, iterations, and the do loop, which will say do something until a condition changes, until it becomes true or becomes untrue, or some other condition is satisfied. And we'll learn all about those going forward. So far, we've seen how Flowgorithm can be helpful to us in testing our logic and learning the logic structuring portion of what we need to train our mind to do as we learn to program. But more than that, Flowgorithm can actually help us learn a little bit about the Visual Basic language, where its limitations end is that Flowgorithm is not going to help us to program the GUI. It's not going to generate code for a graphical user interface only for plain text console work, but I think you'll find that even so, sometimes the tricky part is not the user interface and the graphical elements. The tricky part is often understanding exactly what we have to do in what order in order to structure our algorithm, our logic of our computer program to do the right thing. So here we have Flowgorithm up again with our hello world, and as we saw, we can run that, and not a terribly complex program. Um, it just runs and outputs hello world. But what would that look like in Visual Basic, for example? And so one of the things we can do is we can come to a Flowgorithm and ask it to tell us in the tools, what does the source code look like? And when you first open it, it'll default to Java, which is interesting, and I encourage you to explore this. You can see what this code would look like in a number of different programs. And again, kind of limited and without the GUI, but you can see your logic in all these different languages, including visualbasic.net. But I'm going to ask you to do something a little bit different. Rather than taking the generic visualbasic.net, I want you to open a custom template of visualbasic.net that I have modified specifically to help you in this class. And so let's open that template, and we will get the source code generated in visualbasic.net with a couple of twists from Professor Bek that will help things be a little bit more clear, I hope. So let's open up. I have over in on my computer where I've stored my CIS-119 resources is under Documents, CIS-119, and there's a folder called Source Code Templates, and it may vary if you're running locally and have configured your computer. If you've downloaded your files differently, you would look wherever you'd put them. And under VB.net, and here's the generic template, but here's the one I want, VBNet CIS-119, made just for this class. And I'm going to open that. And so here is our source code generated by Flowgorithm for VB.net. And so it has the entire module, and it's named the module 1 by default. This is one of the things that is named differently if you use the default VB.net template. So I prefer you use mine because you won't have to correct that. I think the default calls it my program, but module 1 is what the current version of Visual Studio is defaulting to. And the other thing that I've done is I have added a line to the template that, since we're generating a console windows close automatically when the program has finished running. And so I've added an extra console.read key, get an input after the end, which will hold that window open long enough for you to see the results. Otherwise, it's very frustrating. You ran the program and blip, the window disappears and you don't get to see, did it did that result work or what did it do? It can be a little bit confusing. So I've made that modification to the template. So let's see how we can use this together with Visual Studio and with the Visual Basic language in order to learn using the Flowgorithm tool. So this tool here will copy all of this code to the clipboard. So I'm going to click on that, and now it's been copied to the clipboard. And now I'm going to change over to Visual Studio, and let's create a new console project in VB. File, New, Project. Here's all the different kinds of projects I can build. Remember, if you've defaulted to something different, if it's showing you C++ or C# or something else, remember to come down to Visual Basic. And in Visual Basic, I want to create a console app for the .NET framework. Name it if you want to name it something different. If you want to change the location, you can change the path to your project here and tell it OK. The project is created, and it's created an empty Module 1 for me. But I have on the clipboard my completed Module 1 from Flowgorithm. So I'm going to highlight everything here, and I'm going to press Control V, or you could say Edit Paste. And there's my code that was generated for me by Flowgorithm. And so now I can study this code to try and understand how it works. And so what I've created in the flowcharting tool and tested in Flowgorithm, I've now translated to Visual Basic. Now again, this isn't coding up for text boxes and buttons and things. This is a plain Jane console window, but a lot of the hard part of what we're trying to learn here is going to be in the core logic that doesn't really have to do with the user interface. And so it can still be very, very useful to get a start. And once you start to understand more about the language itself, you can even take the core code that you create here and move it into a GUI, and you would add or make the changes here. And so instead of the console write line to text, that we might modify the text property of the text box, for example. But let's see what happens when we try and run this. Okay, so it is done a console output of hello world, and now it's waiting to read a key. It's waiting for input, which has held this window open for us. As I said, it would otherwise disobligingly close automatically. And so I'll hit enter, and bam, the program has finished running. Let's take a look. We can actually modify this code so that you could see what would happen if that extra input line, that extra console.read key hadn't been added. One of the things we can do is by putting a single quote at the beginning. Notice that the text all turned green. And again, this color coding is something else that the programmer's editor built into our programmer's toolkit, which is to say Visual Studio, is doing for us, is different colors mean different things. So keywords are in black, structures are in blue, comments are in green, and comments are there for human beings to read to help clarify what the code is doing, or something we need to remind ourselves of, or any other programmer that might start modifying this when we're long gone and have moved on to new jobs or writing new code. Somebody's going to be maintaining our code. The comments can help to clarify exactly what is going on. As a matter of fact, before I made this a comment, you can see there's a comment following this read key command that tells us this line was auto-generated by Flowgorithm to hold the console open until you press a key. I added that comment to the Flowgorithm template that we use to generate the source code, so it would be that comment would be generated here for everybody. And we're going to go ahead and comment this out. So by changing it to a comment, the command is still there, but it's now being interpreted as an instruction or for information just for human beings, not an instruction the computer should run. And now you'll see if we don't hold it open, watch quickly, when we run it, start, the window opens, it ran it closed. Did you see that? Yeah, I couldn't read it that fast either. So that's why we throw the extra input in there to hold the window open. So now that it's asking for the input, let's run it. So here it did the hello world output, and here it's waiting for the next input. That's actually where it's running that read key. And instead of hitting the enter key this time, let's hit the J key. Okay, it doesn't matter. Any key will, once it's read, will move forward. So there we have it. This is how then we can use the Flowgorithm tool to create code that we can use to run in our Visual Basic project. And so this is going to be useful as primarily a learning tool to help us master our VB. So as we start writing more complex code, so when we start declaring variables and then making decisions and adding loops and doing other things, we'll be able to generate that code. You'll be able to test it here in Flowgorithm, but then if you want to see it as generated in the Visual Basic language, you can use the tool's source code viewer and go see it in VB, and you can even export it to working VB code for the console environment. So what is this CloudTime thing? CloudTime is a remote computer that is already configured with all the software you will need for this course running in the cloud. In this case, it's the Amazon Web Services cloud and provided at no cost to you. So that's a really cool deal, particularly if you don't have the most up-to-date computer, or if you're running a Mac or a Chromebook, or if you are using some other device that is not convenient or not possible for you to install the software that we're running this term. You can do that right in the cloud at no cost. So I've got a CloudTime computer running to kind of show you what this is like. I'm going to start the remote desktop protocol, the Windows remote client, and I'm going to paste in the IP address that was given to me when I launched CloudTime and told my instance to start running, and tell it to connect. And then I'm going to go ahead and connect to it, and by default, it's going to try and log in usually as the administrator from my local machine. I'm going to tell it use a different account, and that's the administrator, just plain administrator, cased exactly that way, and the password that I have provided to you, and you should probably change that soon for your instance so that you're not running with the default password, and tell it OK. It'll ask me if that's trusted. I'm going to say yes. And after a moment or two, I should get a desktop connection. Oh, and I say I've already left Visual Studio running. Let me go ahead and, oops, let me close Visual Studio here, because it would not ordinarily have been running when you first log on. So when you first log on, you'll find that you have the applications you need. Typically, I will have docked them to the taskbar. So here's your Flowgorithm, and that's all ready to go. And here is your Visual Studio, and you're all ready to go there, except for one thing, and that is we'll be using Visual Studio Community Edition, and quite likely the trial period will have expired when you come to log on, and so it's going to ask you for a personalization of a Microsoft account. So if you already have a Microsoft account, you log in with your Microsoft credentials, and that copy of Community Edition, which is free, becomes licensed to you, and you can use that in perpetuity. So here it's told me your license has gone stale and must be updated. So I need to log in again with my um, uh, uh, my Microsoft account. If you don't have a Microsoft account, you can just come right on over. Let me go ahead and sign this out. And when I go to sign in, there's an option here. You can sign up if you don't already have an account, and that'll bring you to the Microsoft sign-in page, and you can go ahead and sign into that. I'm going to go ahead and close that for now, rather than going through all of that at the moment. But once you have signed in, the software, as I said, is free, and that license will be registered to you, and you should only have to do that the very first time that you log in to your Visual Studio on CloudTime, and then you're going to be all ready to start creating your Visual Studio projects. And that's it. When we're done with this, we generally want to do one thing. Rather than just closing the connection, we'll want to actually shut the system down. It's supposed to shut down automatically after 8 hours, but it does, even though this costs you nothing, it does cost the college something. So it's always nice if you will take a moment and power the system off when you're done, and that will stop the clock from running on the taximeter, as it were, for your virtual instance, and that will allow us to extend our AWS grant funds a little bit further and continue to make this free for everyone. So I'll go ahead and tell it to shut down this instance, and off we go. And you can do that from a Mac. There are RDP clients available for, oh gosh, Android devices, for iOS devices. So in theory, I think it would be rather painful to try and do all the typing you need to do from your cell phone, but you could, in a pinch, actually access your CloudTime computer and do Visual Basic programming right from your cell phone, tablet, or other device. It works beautifully from Chrome, as well as from Mac OS, and from, as we saw here, from Windows. So if you have a Windows machine and either don't want to, or for whatever reason are unable to install the software locally, you'll have everything you need already configured, debugged, and ready to run for the term. Let's explore what you need to do in order to request your CloudTime computer, and explain why that's necessary. So CloudTime is integrated into Canvas by a tool that we use, and that tool doesn't know about you, your existence in Canvas, until you try and talk to CloudTime. So the first thing you need to do is come in here and try and launch a CloudTime computer. And you'll notice I'm masquerading as a student, so this is similar to the view you will have. And let's go ahead and click launch. And until I have added you, you'll get a message you don't have assigned machines. And the ironic thing is, until you have received this message and CloudTime learns that you are looking for a machine, it doesn't know about you, so I don't have you in the list of students that I can add. So I need you to do this first. Now, once you've done that, you can expedite things a little bit by then posting a request, because I won't necessarily know automatically that you've gone there. I look at it often, but I may miss it. And so once you've tried to launch it, come on over to the discussion and post a request that you would like to be added. And so here's a sample message. Anything similar to this message will be fine. I'm just going to copy it. And unfortunately, under the Canvas, student view for the professor, I don't actually have the ability to post. So let me go ahead and leave the student view. We'll pretend I'm still a student. And now I have the ability to reply, and I will post this in here, and maybe sincerely, Pat student, and we post it. Now, I've signed my name, my pretend name, Pat Student. Really, it's going to appear, even if you forget to sign your name, I'm going to see who made the post, and then I'll be able to respond to that, because when you post here, I'm subscribed to this discussion. It will send me an email immediately and say, hey, you have somebody waiting for something. Why don't you go take care of that, Mr. Beck? And so I will. Let me go ahead. I'm just going to delete this so it's not hanging out in our shell. So now we're back in the instructor view. Let me go show you what I see in the CloudTime shell. So what I will see as the professor, I'll come in to launch a CloudTime lab computer in the cloud, and I'll open that up. And now that you have once tried to open it and not been able to, I will see the instances that I've created, and notice that this instance is not assigned to anyone. And I can come in here, and in the actions, I can assign that to test student, or Pat Student, or John Smith, or Jane Doe, whatever your name is. But you have to have gone there first, or I won't see your name listed there. And now that I've assigned the instance to you, that's yours for the rest of the term, and you're all set up with a remote cloud computer with all the software you need set up and ready to go. In summary, Visual Basic is a modern computer programming language, which is an excellent first language for students and beginning programmers. Programming languages must have a regular grammar, with a regular structured syntax, which ensures that instructions are complete, correct, and unambiguous. Logic of a program is expressed through flow of control structures such as sequence, decision, and repetition structures. VB also supports a graphical user interface, as well as the ability to create text-based console projects. Visual Studio is a modern programmer's workbench or integrated development environment. It incorporates an intelligent source code editor, compiler, linker, and debugger into a single feature-rich developer's tool. Visual Studio can be used to develop many different kinds of code projects in a variety of different programming languages. Flowgorithm is a useful teaching and learning tool. It allows students to create the visual logic for a program using standard flowchart symbols. The program created can be run and tested. Flowgorithm can generate source code in many different languages, including VB. Using the source code template the instructor has provided for this course, Flowgorithm can generate VB console code that students can use for learning and problem solving in their coursework this term. Flowgorithm does not generate GUI code for Windows Form application projects, but the core logic of the console-based VB code it does generate can be adapted and used in GUI projects as the student becomes proficient in VB and GUI programming. CloudTime provides SBCC CIS students with a free virtual computer in the cloud, pre-configured with all the software needed for this course. You may use your CloudTime computer from just about any computer that you have, including Windows, Mac, Chrome OS, Linux, Android, and iOS devices, including smartphones and tablets. This concludes the lesson.